Remastered editions seem to come out a dime a dozen lately. And while yes, it'd be nice to see some more innovation out of the industry at this point, these remasters are a great opportunity to revisit classic games that you might have missed. It's great for games that fill a niche, or was on a system that not many people owned, like let's say the PlayStation Vita. Which is appropriate, as it's the Vita remastered port of the cult hit Gravity Rush that we'll be taking a look at in this review. Coming off the news that the sequel will be coming to the PlayStation 4, Gravity Rush Remastered sells for $29.99 and comes out on February 2nd. It attempts to bring the action to the sky as you fly from area to area, kicking enemies out of the air while dodging projectiles left and right. Can it soar beyond its PlayStation Vita roots, or will its wings get clipped before it truly takes flight? That's what I'm here to answer, but before I begin, this key was obtained from Sony for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? The story starts out with the main character, Kat, waking up with no memory of who she is and in an unfamiliar place. She ends up running into a mysterious black cat named Dusty, who basically gives her superpowers, the ability to control gravity in particular. This plot plays out as Kat attempts to fit in as a shifter, trying to win over the people of this new world who are unsure of who she is. Now the story falls into the alien superhero trope strongly. A lot of the themes of the game involve Kat trying to fit into this new world and the people around it, while going on a journey of self-discovery. And in particular, the characterization of Kat is probably the strongest element of this writing. You connect with Kat, despite the fact that she may fall into some common tropes related to anime and young female protagonists. You want to know more about her and her mysterious past, and want to see her succeed. In fact, characterization is good as a whole here. Even smaller side characters that only show up for a small period of time do have reasonable motivations and connections to the story behind them. The main antagonists of the game are the mysterious Nevi, ancient creatures with sort of obvious glowing weak points. You think that they're animal-like at first, just creatures attempting to take over with no reason or thought process behind them, only acting on instinct alone. But at one point, the game introduces a side to them that you're not expecting, and then really never goes back to it. Sure, they're being influenced by a possible outside source at some points, but there was one scene in particular that seems to give them more humanity than I expected. That's sadly a theme to this game. There's a really weird inconsistency that develops throughout its writing, a consistency in those inconsistencies. When it comes to the main plot themes, it was like there were plot points that were axed off, cut out in the original game, leading to some missing connections. If you're looking for these connections closely, you can see the small elements that some of the plots come from, but they are a stretch at times. Now, the main portion of the story is presented in a comic book panel style, and for me, it works in its superhero comic presentation. It works well with this story, as the goofy yet semi-serious nature fits well into this style. It's the balance between those two sides that works so well here, almost what you'd expect from a game with anime influences. But what may be the biggest letdown here is a lack of a proper conclusion. Sure, there will always be elements in stories that will never be tied up in a traditional sense, but here I felt like the game raced to its conclusion and cut out a good amount of storytelling along the way. Big subplots are never touched again, almost like they didn't exist, and frankly, too many questions are left hanging for what hopefully will be answered in the sequel. But the story surrounds what is probably the main appeal of the game, the gravity-based gameplay. And luckily, it works well for the most part, as flying around the city and battling the Nevi can be some great fun. And compared to our more recent game that I played, called Rodea the Sky Soldier for the Wii U, it's leaps and bounds ahead of some of its equivalent competition. There's a couple of parts that make up the overall action-adventure portfolio here. From the main hub world, you can fly around to the main or side missions. There is an exploration part to the game that takes advantage of the flight mechanics, as you'll need to work your way to specific landmarks by traveling over the city or running through its side streets. The game puts gems and collectibles out there to try to encourage the exploration element, And I will admit, there's something pleasing about speeding through the environment, letting the rush of the wind hit your character while just sort of getting lost in it. On the flip side, the game has one reasonable annoyance here. The game wants you to remember a lot of information at times, in particular with past missions. Where did you first show up in this world? The game asks you. And you're sitting there going, well, I'd love to tell ya, but this map really doesn't have markers telling me a lot of things. In fact, it's sorta shit. Considering that there's a lot of layered environments, you can get lost very easily. Even when the game gives up and gives Kat the self-reminder of, oh, it's there, you can still get lost, as it doesn't show elements in your way when pointing you to your mission goal. When it comes to combat, you have your typical action-oriented combat on the ground, with a semi-limited arsenal. Now, Kat can kick the crap out of her enemies and dodge their attacks, but she can speed around using a ground dash as well, which helps in pacing out combat a tiny bit better. She'll eventually get a special attack as well, such as changing into a black hole and hitting enemies over and over and over again. Now, this ground combat is rather basic. There's no selectable lock-on system, and you'll basically just hit the kick button over and over and over again. In some situations, it's best to also grab the environment around you and chuck a bench or some rocks at an enemy, which was always a nice change of pace. But this ground combat still is rather basic with that said, and it doesn't have a lot of complexity to it. It only gets that complexity with bigger enemies, but you're not staying on the ground in that case. No, the big draw here, it's the aerial combat. Now again, your arsenal is somewhat limited here. You can only really kick or use a special attack, but there's a lot more involved when fighting in the skies. Charging at an enemy and hitting their core can be thrilling, especially when you're hitting multiple enemies in a row. Now, like I said earlier, there is no traditional lock-on system in this game. With flying, however, you do have a cursor that shows up, and if you are skilled enough to keep a moving enemy within it, there's a sense of accomplishment of hitting that weak point of that speeding enemy. With that said, even after playing through the 10 hours of the game, I still wasn't able to do that on a regular basis. For specific enemies, you'll burn through your special ability that can more easily lock on and home in on an enemy, and then wait until it refills so that you don't take too much damage while trying to take it down. I do truly wonder how well this game would have played with something like the PlayStation Move, where there could have been possibly a bit more precision gotten out of the controls. Yes, I know, motion controls, but in this specific case, it may have been justified. However, at least I can rest easy that there wasn't a version of the game that had those controls in it that I couldn't obtain. And before you ask, yes, I'm still bitter about Rodea the Sky Soldier for the Wii U. Nevertheless, it does take some time to get used to these controls. The game focuses on aerial action, and being able to precisely kick an enemy will take some time. But I found the controls to be functional in the most part, and as I got more used to them, I was able to kick from enemy to enemy a lot easier than I would have originally thought. One slight note, however, it was pretty easy on the enemies with multiple weak points to spam the attack repeatedly to take out a couple of their points at a time. And in particular with bosses, you could end up doing significant amounts of damage by spamming kicks very close to them, assuming they didn't have an attack ready to fire at you right then and there. Honestly, I got used to the flying mechanics, and it wasn't my biggest grievance in terms of controls. No, the one thing that truly bothered me was the throwing mechanics. Specifically, every time you picked up an object, your character would go into a hover off the ground. Now you may think, well, what's the harm in that? Well, in terms of aiming precision, a lot. Because you've now added the third dimension to the pitching of items at your enemies. You now need to be very careful of your controller placement as well, due to its effects on gameplay with the 6-axis controls. Frankly, I ended up immediately hitting L1 as soon as I picked up something in almost every case, forcing me back to the ground right away. This may seem minor, but it really annoyed the hell out of me by the time the game was done. In addition, the camera does its best to try to keep up with the action, and you do have control of it with the right stick as well as small control via the 6-axis controls. And for a good part of the action, it does the job. Now with the fast-paced fighting, the camera would have trouble at times turning, and it wouldn't always exactly give me the view that I wanted. But given how fast it can play, I can see why they implemented it this way. It would have been disorienting otherwise, and could have caused severe motion sickness. Now, I'm not sure if we'll ever see this problem truly be fixed in terms of the camera, but for me, Gravity Rush did a good, not great job of working around it. I felt like when the game got going, it really was a unique experience that was sort of rough around the edges. When there's a bunch of enemies on screen, taking them down one by one while having bullets come left and right was thrilling, and it kept the adrenaline up. The game does a good job of pacing this as well, starting off slow and letting you get used to the controls, and then pick the right times to take it to the next level. The game does a smart job with messing around with expectations as well, and changing up the gameplay in the main and side story arcs. Shortening your flight time, forcing you to do more traditional platforming, or having you manage fires breaking out on an airship throughout the city. The game introduces new mechanics at a reasonable pace, and the game did well in keeping me engaged in longer play sessions. The game does give you a bit to do in the side missions beyond the story-based sections of the game, and they range from throwing things at enemies in a small time frame to racing down the streets of a town. In the big picture, there isn't the greatest amount of variety here, although the game does add small elements of a new challenge or a small twist as you go on throughout the game. While unnecessary to beat the game, it does however provide the biggest source of the upgrade gems that the game has to offer, so those looking for a little bit of help in combat will do well to grab a side mission or two to help them out. Now, the DLC from the Vita is included here for more story-based side missions that have a bit more variety, and allow you to change into some different costumes for Cat as well. But in terms of the missions, I have one big grievance. I wanted a restart mission option. Badly. Now, on a completely different note, and on the enjoying little stupid things way too much side of the game, this game made me feel like an asshole. Why? Well, I had this unreasonable sense of fun just knocking people over by walking into them, which became a mini-game of sorts. Also, when using your gravity powers, sometimes you'd lift people into the air around you, and watching them scream as they go flying with you never got old. Yes, I'm an asshole. Also, cat face planning. Over and over again. The game has seemingly got a reasonable graphical upgrade with its remastering, as I'll put the two side by side here. The game definitely does have some rough spots with some textures of the environment still, but puts the emphasis on the characters in the world, and it succeeds for the most part. The cel-shaded style is usually one that I love, and there's no exception here. There's a definite improvement regardless, and I felt like that the effort was put in actually improving the experience here, and not just throwing a port together. I will admit something though, I do question the color choice of the default colors of Cat. Not that the look doesn't work for her, it does. I love the character design, and if it was separated from everything else, it'd be perfect. But a lot of the game's environments are browns, grays, and yellow tones, which Cat also is. She doesn't necessarily blend into the background, but she also doesn't necessarily stand out either. It's not a huge issue, but it will come into play once in a while. One improvement that I hoped to see with the Vita port that didn't make it into the game had to do with the game's draw distance. When looking for water to put out fires, for example, not being able to see too far to find the water towers I needed did work against the game's gameplay. Now you'll notice some pop-in while playing as well, but it's not game-breaking, but annoying enough to get on your nerves. However, the game's performance is great. It seemingly runs at 60 frames per second, with no technical issues there. But you're probably wondering why that's not translating to the footage on screen right now. Now, I have an older version of the Elgato Game Capture HD, and while at times it can capture at 60 frames per second, it couldn't on this game. When I get the chance, I will have to upgrade, but if you're wondering about the performance of the game, it works wonders. Music is also a strong point, especially when it comes to the in-game locations. Each area of the town, for example, has a track that fits its persona, like the entertainment district having a high-energy song that features some great violin and drum combinations. It's a great complement to the sound design of combat and exploration, as the details here were executed rather nicely. The sound of the wind blowing as you fly through the air, or the impact of hitting the ground and the oomph made by Cat as she hits it. Yes, this is still funny. One thing to note, however, is that the game doesn't have English voiceovers. In fact, I almost want to say the voice acting is in French, which sort of surprised me. Now, the game has inspirations from its creator, Kiichiro Toyama, who I probably butchered the name of, but he cited that Moebius's French comics were the inspiration of the world, so it sorta makes sense. In the end, I see the appeal of why Gravity Rush Remastered was loved as a Vita title, and there's definitely some strengths in the game's combat and exploration systems. It does stand out against a lot of games as well, as those lately that have tried this formula of aerial combat and exploration have failed in the most part. But with that said, the game was a bit rough in the big picture. Certain elements didn't come together well as an entire package. The highlight of the game is Cat, the unique aerial gameplay, and a touch of charm that the game adds to its upgraded visuals and unique style. But an uneven execution, some repetition in gameplay elements, and a lacking conclusion puts the game at a 7.5. A very good game that could have been taken to another level if some more cohesion was built into it. It does make me excited to see what the sequel can do to take the gameplay to the next level, and you do get a good amount of content here for the price tag in question. Those looking to soar with the eagles will want to take a look at this unique action game.